tonight we're talking about U.S. strategy in Syria, Iraq, and toward the ISIS Islamic State. It's a terribly complex matter, as all of us appreciate. The unraveling of the diverse forces that are within it is in itself a major exercise. And of course, the stakes in both in Syria are obvious. The world is being torn apart in many ways in Europe and elsewhere by it. It's enormously serious. We're delighted that we have with us tonight Professor Biddle, who is one of the nation's really foremost authority on the kind of conflicts that exist there. Professor Biddle is a graduate of Harvard, BA, with magna cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, in fine arts. I'm highly amused by this because I'm listening to a taped book about the variety of intellectuals who were part of the British war effort during World War II, and the variety of fields from which they came. And the criteria, of course, had to do with quality of questions and thought, of course. But that caught my attention when I noticed that his degree was in fine arts. But he started working at the Institute for Defense Analysis upon graduation from Harvard. Over the years, for 17 years or so, he remained associated with that institute, interrupted partially by time back at Harvard again as a postdoc research assistant, and he also had gotten his degree, master's degree in public policy from the Kennedy School, and then done PhD work, which he later completed for his PhD in international politics or public policy from Harvard. His career his career is what he's going to tell us about tonight in a way. He'll make a better introduction of himself than one could. But I should mention that he taught at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He was an adjunct professor at Columbia for a number of years, overlapping with time at the Council on Foreign Relations. And he was a professor at the Army War College. And during the time that he was at the Council on Foreign Relations, he also worked on the advisory groups to General Petraeus in Baghdad, also as an advisor in Kabul, and then again to Petraeus's Central Command a little bit after that. His book written about the power of war power was written in 2004 and has 4 major awards. His publications are extensive in the major journals of the United States. Of course, he's testified before Congress and has been a much sought-after consultant about these matters of strategy. I'm delighted that he's has the word strategy in his title. It suggests that there are ends to be considered, complex circumstances to be analyzed, and a problem of bringing resources to bear on them. So to talk about U.S. strategy in Libya and Syria and towards the Islamic State is to me profoundly interesting. It's a great pleasure to present Professor Stephen Biddle.
With your permission, I think I'll use this mic. In general, I find mobile targets are harder to hit. And so there's some utility in being able to move around a bit. General Petraeus actually had a very hard time filling the art historian billet in Baghdad. But I'm regularly struck by how useful it is. I think back to Munch's The Scream fairly regularly in this line of work. The announced topic is U.S. strategy for dealing with the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, so I suppose I ought to talk about U.S. strategy for dealing with the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. But an interesting feature of this problem is that most of what's interesting about it is not actually unique to Iraq or Syria, or for that matter, to the Islamic State. This is a representative case of a collection of dilemmas that face us in very similar ways, differing mostly in detail, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Ukraine, potentially in Estonia and the Balkans. The problem of dealing with real but limited threats to U.S. national security is an endemic problem for American strategy now, and it's likely to continue to be a major systematic problem for American strategy, probably for the next generation. And what makes it such a difficult problem, and what makes all of these situations so controversial in their particular details but subject to this general theme, is that in a sense you can think of kind of three broad generic alternative strategies you could in principle adopt for dealing with any of these kinds of situations, and none of them are very satisfactory. We can overinvest what most Americans think real but limited stakes are worth. Arguably, that's what we did in Iraq in 2007 in the surge. If you overinvest, you have some possibility of realizing the stake, but you overspend for it. Alternatively, we can do what many would prefer and just say we're going to wash our hands of this problem. It's not worth the investment. We're going to stay the heck out, in which case you sacrifice stakes that, although limited, are real. And this is extremely difficult to do in as contentious a political environment as current American politics are. And in fact, most administrations have a very difficult time doing it. But if you do it, at least you lose the stake cheaply. What most elected officials find instinctive and natural, and what many members of the public think they want, is the third option, which is to try and find some way of triangulating and identifying some real but limited military means to pursue real but limited stakes, in which the costs and the benefits are somehow commensurate. And the problem with that middle option, which instinctively we're drawn to, is that it creates a serious danger of losing the stake, but losing it expensively rather than cheaply. And what I think I want to do then, in light of that, with the remainder of my time, is to explain a bit of why that tends to be the case, in as much as a fair characterization of our strategy for dealing with the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria is that we are now occupying the kind of classic American middle ground. We are in some danger of ending up at the end point, that inevitably you're in danger of ending up with if you try and hit the middle ground and triangulate. And to do so in the particular context of Iraq, Syria, and the Islamic State, but in fact it's quite generalizable. And the way I want to go about that is I'll start by spending a bit of time on what our interests are in Iraq, Syria, and vis-a-vis the Islamic State to make the case, if you decide to agree with me, that we do have real interests, but they're limited and they're not existential. And then I'll talk a bit about the military means that we classically try to employ to deal with real but limited stakes, and why it is that they're so problematic and they so rarely succeed. The short version of the answer to that story is they typically fall afoul of major political interest misalignments between ourselves and the local partners that classically we rely on as a way to get the scale of our investment and the scale of our sacrifice down. And because war, if we're good Clausewitzians, I assume all your members are good Clausewitzians. If we're good Clausewitzians, of course, we recognize that war is a means to a political end. Therefore, the political interests and stakes of the players are central and have a lot to do with success and failure. If the political interests of ourselves and other people that we're going to rely on to do most of the real heavy lifting in the immediate situation on the ground are radically misaligned, this is not a recipe for a happy outcome. So let me then go back and I'll start with what is at stake for the United States in particular in Iraq and Syria vis-a-vis the Islamic State. There are lots of things that we would like to happen in Syria and in Iraq. When you ask what stakes do we have that are plausibly what people in this business call vital, which is defined somewhat circularly as plausibly worth fighting for, the list is really threefold. The first of these, and the most immediate in the debate today, is humanitarian. So Syria is in the midst of what is probably the single gravest humanitarian crisis on the planet at the moment. Well over 200,000 people killed so far with no end in sight. 4 million refugees that have left the country, 11 million internally displaced people. This is a tragedy on a truly remarkable global scale. There is substantial desire among Americans and among Europeans, who of course are the recipient of these refugee flows to a large degree, and the Turks and others in the region, to do something about it. Usually, though, when you look at the history of American strategy and foreign policy, very rarely does the United States use military force for dealing with humanitarian problems unless it dovetails with some other interest as well. Normally speaking, historically, the United States has tended not to go to war for purely humanitarian reasons. This is a particularly grave humanitarian situation, but it would be unusual for the United States to wage war for that reason alone. The second major interest that the United States has at stake in this conflict is homeland security. Lots of people are very concerned that the Islamic State poses a terrorism threat to the continental United States. And one might plausibly expect that relative to other terrorist organizations, the Islamic State might be an unusually grave threat. They have a very large foreign fighter component, much of which is drawn from European countries that hold passports that could make it easier than the average prospective terrorist to penetrate homeland security perimeter defenses and get access to these societies for terrorist purposes. It is a legitimate concern that the Islamic State could kill Americans in terrorist activities on American soil. But when you ask what is the severity, what is the scale, what is the magnitude of the terrorism threat that the Islamic State poses to the United States, it's very hard to see it as existential. Terrorism can become a threat to our way of life if we choose to make it so, but as a contributor to aggregate morbidity and mortality in the United States, it's a rounding error. Right? If we look at the single most severe year in American history for the loss of life of Americans to international terrorists, 2001, more Americans died of peptic ulcers in 2001 than died of international terrorism. Since 2001, 45 Americans have been killed by international terrorists. More Americans have been killed by domestic terrorists than by international terrorists since 2001. Now, this is not unrelated to the scale of effort that we've gone to try and counter and combat terrorism since 2001. I'm not trying to suggest that this is an unimportant problem or a threat that we shouldn't worry about, or that our own exertions to cope with this threat since 2001 aren't at least partially responsible for the low scale of lethality that this threat has posed. But in the grand scheme of things, if we make the kinds of reasonable efforts to deal with the problem that we have made, I suspect actually you could exclude, for example, the Iraq War from that problem, and I doubt you would change the terrorist mortality toll very much. If we make reasonable efforts on this scale, it is unlikely that the Islamic State is going to be able to kill thousands of Americans. This would be a literally unprecedented, if they could repeat it, scale of terrorist threat to the American homeland. What terrorism is a real but limited national security threat. Now, it's a very serious political management problem, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to minimize the degree to which our elected officials have to worry about terrorism as a problem. As a threat to American life and property, however, we need to keep it in context, and that context is quite limited. The third U.S. national security interest at stake here is economic. Civil wars of the kind that we now see ongoing in Syria have a documented tendency to spread across borders. The Syrian war is already spreading in a variety of directions. If we look at this problem empirically, though, in a larger context, Of 142 civil wars, roughly analogous to that being fought in Syria now, that were waged between 1945 and 1999, 61 of them eventually spread across their borders in a sense that involved major military intervention by the neighbors. I mean, depending on how you code the data sets and score the cases, north of 40% of the time, wars like Syria spread. And the central fault line in the Syrian civil war is an ethno-sectarian divide between Kurdish ethnics, Arab ethnics, and Shiite Muslims and Sunni Muslims. Those fault lines run throughout the region. It would not be implausible to suppose that if this war continues to its natural endpoint, that it could very well suck in a substantial fraction of the country's neighbors and potentially a major part of the Persian Gulf. One reasonable way of describing the war in Syria is that it's a proxy conflict between the Saudis and the Iranians. If the Saudis and the Iranians get involved more directly than they are, most of the Persian Gulf's energy industry could be caught up in this conflict by the time it ends. And of course, the Persian Gulf's energy economy is a major part of the global economy. If this war were to eventually spread to involve the entire Gulf Cooperation Council, and in a way that cut their oil exports by 50%, this is a wild guess, but not a completely implausible one, 50% of GCC exports at roughly today's level of production is about 13 million barrels a day. 13 million barrels a day is somewhere in the neighborhood of 15% of world production. The best economic industry analyses I've seen were prior to the current glut, but given the inelasticity of demand for this product, I'm not sure that the earlier estimates are all that far off. The estimates I've seen suggest that taking 15% of supply out of the market could be expected to double the price at the time that that occurs, and that a doubling of world oil prices could be expected to take something like 3 to 5 percentage points of GDP growth out of the US economy. Depending on what our output is at the time, that's somewhere between $450 billion and $750 billion a year of lost economic activity in the United States. Even in Washington, that's real money. Right? Those are real people losing their homes. Those are real people losing their jobs. That's real suffering that Americans should care about and that our elected officials should care about. But it's not the Great Depression. We see 3 to 5 percentage point swings in GDP growth all the time as a function of the business cycle. Depending on economic conditions when this occurs, you could imagine tipping the US economy from growth into recession. But we're not headed back to 1932, regardless of what happens in this conflict. I could go on and we could talk about Russian influence and larger regional stability and associated issues. The story, however, in my view, is largely the same. What happens when you articulate seriatim, the US interests at stake in the conflict, is you get a list of things that really honestly do matter, but that aren't existential for the United States. That don't mean our way of life or its loss, that don't mean the deaths of thousands of Americans. And that sets up this dilemma of what do we do about it, given that we don't want to just ignore it. It's very hard to just say, I don't care. I'm going to let a humanitarian crisis boil. I'm going to take the great roulette wheel of the future and gamble that there isn't some massive terrorist attack. And whatever happens to the Gulf oil export industry happens. Very few elected officials are willing to do that. Why then can't we simply find some reasonable, limited, moderate military means to secure these stakes without sending 160,000 American ground soldiers to Syria to deal with this problem? And the reason we can't is interest misalignment, and let me explain more about what I mean by that. Central to most operational concepts for limited war waging is that the Americans are going to supply the technology and somebody else is going to supply the labor. So we will do the airstrikes, or we will provide the equipment, or we will provide training ideally by highly skilled American commandos, and maybe we'll provide some advising. And if we're really aggressive, maybe we'll help target the airstrikes. But we're not going to provide the infantry, right? We don't do windows. Somebody on the ground locally is going to have to do that. And this sets up a variety of serious interest alignment problems. Let me start with the interest alignment problem between us and our enemy, the Islamic State. Our interests are real but limited. Al-Baghdadi's interests and the interests of his Islamic State lieutenants are not limited. Right? This is existential for them. There are serious constraints on how much effort we're willing to expend on this problem. That's not true for him. And that's not true for the people who are fighting with him. Their lives are on the line in this. And that means when American aircraft show up at 10 or 15,000 feet and start dropping precision munitions on their positions, they don't immediately throw up their hands and say, "We surrender," and go home. That would likely get most of them killed by the people at home once they laid down their arms, even if they didn't get killed by the American bombing. Given that their stakes are unlimited, what they do, of course, is to adopt the standard playbook of how to get out from under American air power and still wage war that most people who've been exposed to American air power since 1991 have figured out to do. They dismount from armored vehicles, they wear civilian clothing, they disperse among civilian populations, and they embed themselves in urban areas in ways that make it very, very difficult for us from great distances and high altitude to find the targets, and even harder to kill them once we find them without killing large numbers of civilians in a war that we're justifying in the first place for humanitarian reasons. Vladimir Putin can flatten urban areas in Syria and be perfectly consistent with his perceived self-interest in this conflict. We can't. Right? Even if a President Trump, right? Or a President Cruz, for that matter, were to decide that they're going to, this carpet bombing is a very hard to define term, but decide that they're going to simply lay waste to urban Raqqa in order to deal with the Islamic State, it would be self-defeating in terms of the interests that we're waging the war to secure. We're not going to do that. The Islamic State knows we're not going to do that. That means that we're not going to be able to simply annihilate them from 10,000 feet with precision-guided munitions. What we can do from 10,000 feet with precision-guided munitions is empower a skilled, motivated, proficient ground force to work together with the air power to gradually retake ground. And that brings us to the problem of our allies. We have an obvious interest misalignment with the enemy, but we've got serious interest misalignments with all of our prospective partners on the ground that we're asking to do the heavy lifting and provide the infantry to work with our air power. So let's start with ally number one in this problem, the government of Iraq. What we would like from the government of Iraq is to have them defeat these Islamic State guys, retake Fallujah and Mosul, reestablish Iraqi sovereignty over all of Iraqi territory, and prevent this humanitarian crisis in Syria and this terrorism threat to the United States and this economic threat to the global economy. Those are not the primary priorities of Haider al-Abadi and the government of Iraq, nor can they be. By definition, if there is a serious terrorist threat or a serious insurgency problem or a serious internal violence challenge confronting an American partner, it is normally because the partner has serious governance problems. We don't do counterinsurgency in Switzerland very often. And the reason is they don't need it. If a partner needs it, there's a reason, and the reason is usually that it's a weakly institutionalized society in which there are serious problems of factionalism and the control of political violence. in weakly institutionalized, weak governance societies like Iraq or like Afghanistan or like Libya or like Ukraine. There's a certain pattern here. In societies of this kind, classically the way regimes create order and reduce the threat of political violence against themselves is by maintaining what's sometimes been called a double balance, in which the balance of armed violence potential among elites within the regime that have access to violent force is roughly aligned with the balance of economic spoils that they're extracting from the society. If those two balances are in alignment, then by and large, militia leaders or intelligence officers or army officers or armed political party leaders are satisfied with what they're getting and they're willing to accept the status quo. If that double balance gets out of alignment in either direction, people get very dissatisfied and you have a serious danger of internal violence that can cause coup d'etat and the death of not just the leadership, but the leadership's family and everyone they know. And this is a literally existential threat and interest to them that is internal to their own regime. And then in most cases is much more immediate than the threat posed by the Islamic State, which after all is an essentially Sunni organization sitting on essentially Sunni Iraq, whereas the leadership group of the state of Iraq at the moment is Shiite and remains in control of the overwhelming majority of Shiite Iraq. The threat posed by al-Baghdadi and the Islamic State to the government of Iraq is in many ways much less severe than the threat posed to the government of Iraq by other elements of the government of Iraq. Any of a dozen major Shiite militias in the country that collectively have far more armed personnel than the Iraqi State Army has, or the Iraqi State Army itself. So, how then do you maintain a double balance in a society like this? And some of the ways you do it are you deliberately make sure that no one actor, and especially the state military and police, normally the prospectively most powerful and most dangerous armed element within the society, gets too powerful and is uncontrollable by you. And the classic means that autocrats adopt to ensure that this is the case are things like corruption. We look at corruption and we think, of course, it's a terrible problem, and it's unethical, and it's inappropriate, and it's destructive of economic growth, representative government, military effectiveness. Corruption in societies like this is classically a means by which the regime ensures the loyalty of the military and of militia leaders within the country to the regime. Another classic means that regimes use in these kind of situations to ensure the loyalty of various armed elites within the system is cronyism. The corps commander, the brigade commanders, and the minister of defense are related to me by blood or marriage. Or they're people that I was in exile with together in Iran for 20 years while Saddam Hussein was in charge. Or there are people that I went to school with and I've known since I was 12, because I've got this bond, this personal bond of trust and loyalty. I know, or at least I'm more confident, that Frank is not going to march on the Capitol and take over the coercive instruments of the government in order to get a bigger slice of the pie than he's now getting, because I trust him and I know him. Whether Frank is a highly trained, proficient military technocrat is of third or fourth order consequence. Last but not least, I don't want the military itself to simply get too strong. So devices like divided lines of command and restriction of access to foreigners and rapid rotation of officers so they can't create local coup conspiracies that get embedded through long exposure all systematically reduce the military's military effectiveness, and that helps maintain the balance within the ruling system. All of these things collectively are proven to be quite effective, actually, in reducing the risk of political violence within the society and within the regime, but they also systematically reduce that military's ability to deal with the external threats that we care about. Corruption systematically saps combat motivation from military organizations. The Americans may or may not know what our allies do with their money, but their troops sure do. When the troops go out on patrol and there's no gasoline to run the vehicles more than halfway into the patrol because the gas has all been sold on the black market, or there's no water to keep us hydrated through this patrol in 120-degree temperatures because it's all been diverted onto the black market, or the force we have available to defend ourselves out on patrol is half what it's supposed to be because half of them are ghost soldiers that exist only on the payroll and not in reality. U.S. intelligence may or may not have picked this up, but the troops and the units know. And when it becomes clear, as it always will, that a corrupt officer corps is more concerned with other things than whether I live to see the end of this patrol, people start losing interest in patrolling. And it is systematically the case and is consistently so through a huge swath of military history that significantly corrupt military organizations have a great deal of difficulty producing combat motivation in the troops, which makes them a very weak instrument for conquering Raqqa and destroying the Islamic State. Cronyism does not produce proficient, efficient military staff work. Right? All of these techniques combined reduce the military's threat to the regime, but it also reduces the military's threat to the Islamic State, or to al-Qaeda, or to anyone else that we're worried about, and the locals are unfortunately rather less worried about than we are. So we Americans show up and we say, Hyder, here's the deal. We will provide the air power, and we'll train your guys, and we'll give you equipment, and we'll provide advisors to help you, choose patrol routes and decide which neighborhood to assault first when you're going to retake Mosul. And we assume that if they're not very good at this to begin with, it's because they don't have enough training, they don't have enough weapons, they don't have enough advisors, they don't have enough other equipment. We can fix that, right? It's a lot cheaper than sending 160,000 Americans to Iraq to provide all of these things. All of these things don't change the politics of the situation, though. And it's the politics of the situation that are the primary barrier to real military effectiveness from the partners that we're relying on to take advantage of our airstrikes. The last thing that most of our partners can afford to do, in fact, is to allow us to professionalize their military. Right? A professional, proficient, well-armed, well-equipped, American-trained military is perceived by most regimes in these situations as an enormous threat, not a benefit. Right? This is an organization that they don't control, that's now a 900-pound gorilla that's threatening everybody else in the environment, that is probably hostile to all the other actors who continue to be corrupt, is certainly hostile to all the cronies that I trust, and moreover is probably a Trojan horse for American foreign policy interests that don't necessarily align very well with ours. This isn't a feature, it's a bug. Right? The kind of military we just assume that everybody wants is a monumental threat to stability in most of the societies where we're trying to build it. And the net result of this, of course, is that these militaries are very resistant to this kind of improvement. And we end up providing the airstrikes, but have great difficulty getting allies on the ground to do their part. Let me just briefly address one other flavor of partner, and then I'll get on to what then might one do about this, given the frustrating nature of the problems created by these interest misalignments. Various Americans have hoped that we could create a rebel army in Syria. Not a state government like Iraq, but anti-Assad rebels that will overturn the Assad government and destroy the Islamic State. And we've tried to apply a very similar formula for dealing with them. We will train them, we will advise them, maybe, we will equip them, we will fly airstrikes on their behalf, and the result has been no more satisfying than it has been with the Iraqi state military, because all the same issues obtained, but more so. So we work with militia leader A and militia leader B. And we're going to, their forces are each too small to destroy the Islamic State, but together maybe they could accomplish something. So we provide training, equipment, and advising. And we want them to cooperate with each other to accomplish some larger military mission, march on Raqqa and overthrow the Islamic State's capital. And so these two militia leaders are assigned to carry out an offensive on a village. You're supposed to guard his flank. You're the assault force. Jump-off time is 0500. We'll provide you with all the air cover you need. Go to it. And you two guys are each looking at each other and saying, when this thing is over, there's going to be some sort of post-war political process. If Assad actually falls, if the Americans get their way, and this happens, there's going to be some attempt to construct a new government. And the political history of the region is that these kinds of struggle for political control are zero-sum, winner-take-all contests, where the second-place finisher usually ends up hanging at the end of a noose. Am I going to be first place, or are you going to be first place? So, I'm supposed to protect your flank. Darn it, the vehicles broke down, we couldn't get past the line of departure in time, and yeah, we know you got counterattacked and wiped out because you had an exposed dangling flank, and we're terribly, terribly sorry. Right? I mean, the warlords and militia leaders that we want to get over it and cooperate. Right? We are tremendously frustrated all the time at the lack of cooperation we can get among rebel leaders in Syria. They just can't seem to unify, and there's a very good reason why they can't seem to unify. They're scared to death of each other. And for perfectly sensible reasons, right? A rational person in their situation, facing the constraints and the circumstances they are, would be afraid too. But given those constraints and given those circumstances, it's just not realistic for Americans to simply say, get over it, right? Stop worrying about each other and go kill people we want you to kill. And so we have tremendous degrees of difficulty getting rebel groups, whether they be Arab Sunnis or whether they be Kurds, to cooperate with each other and pursue our goals and not their goals. And just like everybody else in the region, for the warlords we're dealing with, their interests are existential. If they get this power balance wrong, and one of their rivals seizes power after Assad, and then does away with the competition, that's fatal for the loser. It's not fatal for U.S. national security, but it is fatal for the loser in that competition. We are, in fact, the only actor in this whole problem, with the possible exception of the Russians, whose interests are limited. All the locals' interests are existential, and the trouble is they're typically in conflict with ours and in tension with each other's. And that's why we systematically have difficulty with the middle option. Because if we're going to rely on local partners and allies to make it less costly and involve less sacrifice for us, we are going to be stuck on the horns of all of these problems of interest misalignment along all the fault lines I described, and it's systematic. It's endemic to the nature of the problem. So given that, what should we do? If any of you can answer that question, John Kerry's email address is john.kerry@state. He would love to hear from you, and so would I, actually, because I think this is a dilemma in the true sense of the word. I mean, it's a dilemma in the sense that there isn't a good, unambiguous, dominating solution that tastes great and is less filling. I mean, all three of the generic alternatives for dealing with these kinds of situations in any of these theaters are bad. So what you're really doing is you're choosing the less bad approach, but there's nothing that isn't bad on the menu. Now, generally speaking, I tend to think that the middle is the worst of the three. If you overspend, at least you get the steak, or you have a decent chance at it. If you stay all the way out, you lose cheaply. If you get halfway in, you run the risk of losing the steak, but investing a lot more in the process. But it's almost impossible to avoid because the political pressures on elected officials to do something are so great in situations that are as salient as Syria and Iraq are right now. And given that, I think what we tend to get is something that looks kind of like what the Obama administration's strategy has been. Airstrikes, training, equipping, and advising. And then that doesn't work. And there's some military reverse in theater. And then there are calls for replacing this feckless policy with something more forceful. But nobody wants to do something forceful enough to actually solve the problem. I mean, if you were to look at current U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine, the United States has a fairly mature, well-developed doctrine for conducting counterinsurgency, i.e. for stabilizing internally unstable societies through the introduction of military power. If you apply the standard troop densities in current U.S. military doctrine to stabilizing the area controlled by the Islamic State, I mean, not having to deal with intermediaries on the ground, but stabilizing the situation, and you do the math, the troop requirement comes out to well in excess of 100,000 American soldiers. And that's just for the part of Syria that the Islamic State now controls. To do all of Syria, add accordingly. Nobody is interested in doing that. But you get all these calls every time something goes badly from Capitol Hill to do more. Because what we're doing isn't working. And so what the administration does is it grinds its teeth and it scuffs its shoes on the floor, and they send another 500 people. And another word for this, of course, is mission creep. And if I were in the investment advising business, I would invest in the mission creep futures market. Prices are going to go up. I think we're headed for a lot more of this in Syria because I think it's just very hard to avoid. The challenge, and I think the best option in the sense of least bad in this situation is slow down mission creep to the extent you can and do less rather than more. But I don't think we're going to I don't think the American political system is going to be able to simply stay out when it's a situation as salient and as visible as Syria and Iraq. The Congo, we can stay out. South Sudan, we can stay out. The Middle East, we've been unable. The Obama administration, for whatever it's worth, tried very hard to stay all the way out. The bottom option of the three was the one they clearly wanted. The president kept all military activity in Syria off the table as long as he could hold to that position. And he finally got dragged off it after the fall of Mosul in Iraq. But it's not because he wanted to escalate. I'm not sure it's avoidable, given that, for my money, I think the least damaging way forward, at least for situations as visible and as salient as Syria and Iraq, is slower mission creep rather than faster mission creep. Do less where possible and wait for the situation to eventually burn itself out. And that's not a conclusion that I like any more than any of you do. How many more hundreds of thousands of Syrians are going to die before that happens? How many terrorist actions like Paris are going to occur before this thing burns itself out? What risk of damage to the global economy might occur if this thing does in fact spread through the rest of the GCC? I don't like the idea of trying to contain the problem at the margin and waiting for it to burn out while not doing enough to actually solve the problem. But doing enough to actually solve the problem is vastly more expensive than you might think from the public debate on this issue in the United States today, and no one is in favor of doing it. The real left and right limits in the debate today are between faster mission creep and slower mission creep. And if that's the choice set, I'm in favor of slower. On that happy note, shall we go to Q&A? That's So the first question was, what does burn itself out mean? Empirically speaking, civil wars of this kind, depending on the data set and the coding rules, last somewhere between 7 to 10 years on average. There's an important minority that lasts as long as a generation, but the kind of median for this phenomenon in the international system is 7 to 10-ish years of duration. The Syria civil war started in 2011, so if it follows the kinds of patterns that are typical, there are big tails around the median, of course, but if it hits the median, then this becomes endable somewhere 2018 to 2021. And the mechanism by which it typically occurs is mutual exhaustion. Right? Because waging war of this kind is very expensive. It burns resources, and it impoverishes the societies that wage it. And typically, conflicts of this kind occur because the local governing model isn't very efficient at either representing the interests of the governed or generating economic growth, and that's why the war started in the first place. So what you're dealing with is a series of prospective governance models. Assad, al-Abadi in Iraq, al-Baghdadi in the Islamic State, that are all deeply flawed, and that all have a great deal of difficulty producing the scale of economic growth required to underwrite military activity indefinitely. And as a result, what tends to happen is they all draw their societal capital base down over the course of the fighting. And eventually it gets drawn down so far that people become open to a negotiated settlement that sacrifices things that they care about and involves huge risks for them personally because they just don't see any other alternative at that point. Now, sometimes you get other exogenous events that end conflicts like this. A lot of these sorts of conflicts ended when the Cold War ended because the Soviet Union had been underwriting one of the two sides, withdrew its support, and the result was a quick negotiated settlement. The Civil War in El Salvador is a classic example of that. That negotiated peace treaty became possible when the rebels lost their financial support. But one way or another, burning the resource level down to the point where it becomes impossible to continue is a classic mechanism, and that's very likely in this situation. The best work I've seen on the Islamic State's economics has been done by my colleague Jake Shapiro at Princeton. And it is Jake's view on the basis of a variety of rather clever data collection strategies. Satellite photography of lights in the society, how that pattern has changed over time, the degree to which that correlates with economic activity. It's hard to get good economic statistics out of Raqqa, but Jake has used a variety of other means for trying to get a read on the state of their economy, and his view is that their expenditures have outstripped their income for quite some time now, and they're likely to drive themselves into the ground. And my guess is what that's going to produce as an end state is something that looks like Somalia across what is now Syria and as many of the neighbors that get drawn into this. If it's truly like Somalia, it can continue for a generation. Remember, there's a tail of this distribution that can last really, really long. My guess is in Syria, it'll produce a scale of poverty that's sufficient after 2018 to 2021 that a negotiated settlement that isn't possible now might become possible. The Russians, for example, will have to get exhausted in order for that to happen, and they're still a ways away from that yet. Yes? The question is, if the strategy is going to be to let things burn out, another word for that is containment, why don't we speed the rate at which it burns out by doing things like targeting the economic assets that the Islamic State is using to actually wage the war, or doing other things that more rapidly cause them to burn through their capital base and get us to this moment at which a negotiated settlement might be possible. And there are all sorts of things we could do. We've been trying to get the Turks to seal the border. The Turks, of course, have a variety of political interests in this conflict that don't match ours very well. The Turks are much less concerned with the Islamic State than they are with either the Kurds or with Assad. And the things we want the Turks to do to hurt the Islamic State tended to facilitate expansion by the Kurds, and the Turks therefore tend to be very resistant to this. Alternatively, the Iraqi government, I believe to this day, but at least as of 3 months ago, was paying government salaries to teachers, firemen, and policemen in the city of Mosul, in the city of Fallujah, the city of Ramadi, various places that the Islamic State has conquered and now controls. And we've gone to Hyder al-Abadi and say, please stop cutting those paychecks. Knock off the remittances. You call these people government employees, but it's another government at this point. You're just fueling the Islamic State. And the Iraqis have historically been unwilling to do it. You could imagine that we could strong-arm them enough to stop doing that. We could target the oil infrastructure that the Islamic State uses to generate a meaningful part of their revenue. We could bomb the oil wells, or we could bomb the trucks that transport the oil. We could bomb pipelines, or we could just bomb banks, right? Famously, the United States bombed a secret vault in which the Islamic State was storing cash. We could bomb bakeries. No, I mean, but the reason I'm framing it this way is these are all variations on a strategy of speeding the impoverishment of the population that lives under the Islamic State's rule. That's a less euphemistic way of describing what any of these strategies do. The Islamic State is essentially a state at this point. It taxes an economy to generate the revenue to wage war. Any of these strategies to hasten their economic collapse are just variations on taking money out of the GDP with either diplomatic means or 10,000-pound bombs or something else. What we're doing is we're taking money out of the economy. I use the example of bakeries because it puts it in a particularly direct sort of way. We can say to ourselves, just stop writing these checks to all those teachers and firemen. And it looks surgical. What it's really doing is it's taking money out of the pockets of potentially starving people in Mosul, and that's why the Iraqi government won't do it. We say that one of our primary interests in this conflict is humanitarian. There's this disaster in which people are leaving their homes, being driven from their country, being killed by their hundreds of thousands. If we're there partly for humanitarian purposes, a strategy that's designed deliberately to inflict suffering on civilians, in this case not by killing them or blowing up their homes, but by destroying their livelihoods, has a certain degree of tension built into it. And the Iraqis have just not been willing to do it, partly because it's their countrymen and partly because the Abadi government believes they will be blamed for it. It could well cause mass starvation in Mosul, and people will not blame the Islamic State. They'll blame Hyder al-Abadi and the government of Iraq, and with some degree of cause. So, I mean, like everybody else in this debate, I throw around terms like containment and burnout. And they're in themselves dangerously euphemistic. I mean, another less euphemistic way of describing this process is we want to drive that population to utter destitution faster, because until they are destitute, a ruthless regime will be able to extract revenue from them to wage war. I mean, the last part of that economy that's going to be allowed to burn up is the part that fuels their military activity. So you're going to have to drive a lot of people into poverty before you start cutting the Islamic State's defense budget. And whether you do that by bombing oil trucks or by bombing bakeries, it's just, money is fungible. Economic activity is fluid and flexible. At the end of the day, it's all in the same coin. And so the Obama administration has been very reluctant to do that for reasons that I understand and I sympathize with. Again, this is a dilemma in the true sense that there aren't any particularly attractive options. But they've been very reluctant to accelerate a process that many clothe in euphemism and is actually has the potential to cause a lot of suffering. Yeah, the question is, do we go to war only for economic purposes and not for humanitarian reasons? And the example of very late response to the Holocaust was raised. That's not quite the way I put it. The way I put it is we go to war when humanitarian interests dovetail with others. When it's humanitarian plus realpolitik, we tend to use force. More frequently than we would if it were only realpolitik. But what we rarely do is send 160,000 soldiers to deal with a problem that is purely humanitarian in which there is no meaningful realpolitik stake for the United States. Now, one could debate whether this is appropriate. Arguably, the most important normative decision that a democracy makes is the decision to kill people in the name of the state by waging war. And the interests and the stakes and the reasons for which we do this should be debated. And I am open to an argument, subject to a variety of issues having to do with the ethics of behavior in the international system. I am open to the argument that the United States should be willing to sacrifice American lives purely on behalf of non-American lives to a greater degree than we normally do. But it's a complicated ethical calculus. What do American elected leaders owe to the Americans that voted for them and whom they tax and whom they have coercive authority over relative to what American elected leaders owe people in other societies? And it gets into the larger philosophical question of cosmopolitanism and the issue of where moral obligation lies. But I think this is a terribly important question, and I'm struck by how little debated it is typically. The role of any of these wars and any of their aspects, moral, practical, military, political, has been invisible in the last several American election cycles, and I think that's an embarrassment for a democracy. You would need an electron microscope to detect the effect of the Afghanistan war on anybody's electoral prospects in the last two election cycles. And that should not be so. That should not be so.
That's terrific. You have something to think about. Tomorrow he talks about the approved solution, but you have to come back for that. This has been a marvelous evening. You've got us thinking. Thanks so much. I enjoyed it.